Am I the asshole for refusing to give my sister my Wi-Fi password after she accidentally gave it to her boyfriend? That question has been haunting me for months now. And what happened next completely shattered everything I thought I knew about my own family. Sometimes the people closest to you are the ones who hurt you the most. My name is Trevor, and I'm 27 years old. This story changed my life in ways I never saw coming, and I'm still dealing with the fallout today. Growing up with Melissa was like having a built-in best friend. She's 25 now, and for most of our lives, we were inseparable. Our parents, Janet and Richard, always said we were their dynamic duo. We shared everything, secrets, inside jokes, even our deepest fears. When Melissa broke her arm in 4th grade, I carried her backpack for weeks without being asked. When I was nervous about asking someone to prom, she spent hours helping me practice what to say. We had that rare sibling bond where we genuinely enjoyed each other's company, even as adults. After college, I found myself living in a small apartment above my parents' garage. It wasn't glamorous, just a converted studio space with basic amenities. But it gave me independence while keeping me close to family. Melissa stayed in the main house, which made sense since she was still figuring out her career path. Our arrangement worked perfectly. I had my privacy, but we could still hang out whenever we wanted. Sunday dinners were sacred in our family, and even during busy weeks we'd find time to catch up. Those were good times. Melissa would come up to my place sometimes just to escape the chaos of the main house, and we'd watch movies or play video games like we were kids again. She'd complain about Mom's constant questions about when she'd find a real job, and I'd vent about the challenges of my new position at a marketing firm downtown. We were each other's safe harbor in the storm of adult responsibilities. Everything started to shift about 8 months ago when Melissa began dating Brandon. At first, I was happy for her. She'd been single for almost a year after a messy breakup with her college boyfriend, and she deserved someone who treated her well. Brandon seemed nice enough during our initial meetings. Polite, respectful, the kind of guy who shook hands firmly and looked you in the eye when he talked. He worked in construction and had that easygoing personality that made him fit right into our family dynamic. But then Brandon started coming around more and more. What began as weekend visits turned into staying over 3 or 4 nights a week. I'd come home from work and see his truck in the driveway, hear laughter coming from the main house. And while I was genuinely happy that Melissa had found someone, something about the situation started to feel different. It wasn't that I didn't like Brandon. I barely knew him well enough to form a real opinion. It was more that Melissa began changing in subtle ways. She became less available for our usual hangout sessions. When I'd text her to see if she wanted to grab dinner or watch our favorite show, she'd often respond that she was busy with Brandon. Their relationship moved fast, faster than I expected, and soon it felt like Brandon had become a permanent fixture in our family home. Mom and Dad didn't seem to mind. In fact, they loved having another person around the dinner table. Dad enjoyed having someone to talk sports with, and Mom was thrilled that Melissa seemed so happy. The first real red flag should have been how Brandon made himself completely at home. Within a month of them dating seriously, he had his own spot on the couch, knew where we kept the good snacks, and was offering opinions on everything from what shows to watch to how Dad should fix the squeaky back door. He wasn't necessarily overstepping boundaries, but there was an assumption of belonging that felt premature to me. I tried to brush off my discomfort. Maybe I was just being overprotective of my little sister, or maybe I was jealous of having to share her attention. These were normal feelings, right? Melissa was an adult who deserved to be happy, and if Brandon made her happy, then I needed to support that. I kept telling myself to give him more time, that my reservations would fade as I got to know him better. But then came the small things that started to add up. Brandon would use our bathroom without asking, help himself to food from the fridge, and once I found him in my parents' garage looking through Dad's tool collection without permission. When I mentioned it to Melissa, she laughed it off. "He's just comfortable here," she said. "Isn't that a good thing? It means he feels like part of the family." I wanted to believe her. But comfort and entitlement are two very different things. Still, these were minor irritations, things I could overlook for the sake of family harmony. What I couldn't have predicted was how these small boundary crossings were just the beginning of something much bigger. The Wi-Fi situation started innocently enough, about 4 months into Melissa and Brandon's relationship. I was working from home one afternoon when Melissa knocked on my apartment door. She had that sheepish smile she'd always worn as a kid when she wanted to ask for a favor. "Hey, Trevor," she said, leaning against my doorframe. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course," I replied, gesturing for her to come in. "What's up?" "So, you know how the Wi-Fi signal downstairs can be spotty sometimes, especially in my room?" she began. "Brandon and I were trying to stream a movie last night, and it kept buffering. I remembered that when I've been up here, your connection always seems super fast. Would it be okay if I got your password? Just for when we really need it? It seemed like such a reasonable request. The house Wi-Fi was older and weaker, and my connection up in the garage apartment was indeed much stronger. I'd invested in a high-end router specifically because I worked from home and needed reliable internet. Sharing it with my sister felt like the natural thing to do. Sure, no problem, I said, writing down the password on a piece of paper. Just don't go crazy with the streaming, okay? I need the bandwidth for work sometimes. You're the best, Melissa said, giving me a quick hug. I promise we'll be reasonable about it. For the first week, everything seemed fine. I didn't notice any significant slowdown in my connection, and I felt good about helping my sister out. It was such a small thing, really, just sharing internet access with family. What could go wrong? The problem started the following Monday. I was in the middle of an important video conference with a client when my screen began freezing. At first, I thought it might be a temporary glitch, but the lag became so severe that I had to apologize and reschedule the meeting. That afternoon, trying to upload a presentation took 3 times longer than usual. By evening, even basic web browsing felt sluggish. Initially, I assumed there might be an issue with my internet service provider. These things happen sometimes, right? But when the slowdown continued for several days, I decided to investigate. That's when I made the discovery that would change everything. When I logged into my router's admin panel to check for problems, I was shocked to see the list of connected devices. Instead of the usual 3 or 4 devices, my laptop, phone, tablet, and smart TV, there were 11 active connections. 11. I stared at the screen in disbelief, scrolling through device names I didn't recognize. There was Brandon's iPhone, Brandon's MacBook, Mike's Galaxy, Tyler's Xbox, Gaming Laptop 5, and several others with generic names that gave no clue to their owners. My heart sank as the reality hit me. Melissa had shared my password with Brandon, which was exactly what I'd given her permission to do. But Brandon had apparently decided that my Wi-Fi was some kind of community resource, sharing the password with his friends without asking anyone's permission. My private internet connection, which I paid for and relied on for my job, had become a free-for-all for people I didn't even know. I sat there staring at the screen, feeling a mixture of anger, disappointment, and disbelief. This wasn't just about internet speed, though that was certainly a problem. This was about respect, boundaries, and the fact that my own sister had allowed someone to take advantage of my generosity. I'd done her a favor, and somehow that favor had been twisted into something I never agreed to. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. These weren't emergency situations where someone desperately needed internet access. Based on the device names and activity logs, it looked like people were gaming, streaming, and downloading large files on my connection. They were treating my bandwidth like it was their personal playground, completely oblivious to the fact that their usage was affecting my ability to work. I decided to confront Melissa immediately. I needed to understand how this had happened and get it resolved before it affected my job any further. I walked down to the main house and found her in the kitchen, scrolling through her phone while eating a bowl of cereal. "Melissa, we need to talk," I said, trying to keep my voice calm and measured. She looked up with a casual smile. "Sure, what's up?" "I need to ask you about the Wi-Fi password I gave you," I began. "When you said you wanted it for you and Brandon, I assumed that meant just you and Brandon, but when I checked my router today, there are 7 extra devices connected to my network." For just a moment I saw something flash across her face. Was it guilt? Embarrassment? But it disappeared so quickly I might have imagined it. Instead, she let out a small laugh and shrugged. "Oh, that," she said, as if it were the most trivial thing in the world. Brandon needed to let a couple of his friends use the internet for like one night. They were trying to download something for work, and their connection at home is terrible. It's no big deal." "No big deal?" I repeated, feeling my temperature rising. "Melissa, there are 7 additional devices on my network. 7. That's not a couple of friends for one night. And my internet has been so slow that I had to reschedule a client meeting because my video call kept freezing." She rolled her eyes in a way that reminded me uncomfortably of our teenage years. "Trevor, come on. It's just Wi-Fi. It's not like it costs extra money or anything." I took a deep breath, trying to maintain my composure. "It does cost extra when it affects my ability to do my job. And more importantly, you asked for the password for you and Brandon. You didn't ask if Brandon could share it with whoever he wanted." "I didn't know he was going to do that," she said, but her tone was defensive rather than apologetic. "He just mentioned it to a few people, and they asked if they could use it. What was I supposed to say, no?" "Yes," I said firmly. "You were supposed to say no. Or better yet, you were supposed to ask me first." Melissa set down her spoon and crossed her arms. "Look, I'm sorry if it's causing problems, but you're kind of making a big deal out of nothing here. Can't you just upgrade your internet or something? I stared at her, genuinely stunned by her response. Not only was she dismissing my legitimate concerns, but she was actually suggesting that I should pay more money to accommodate her boyfriend's friends, using my connection without permission. I'm not upgrading my internet so that Brandon's friends can freeload off me, I said. I'm going to change my password, and I need you to stop sharing it. Fine, she said with an exaggerated sigh. But I think you're being really uptight about this whole thing. That night I changed my Wi-Fi password and felt a mixture of relief and sadness. Relief that I'd regained control over my internet connection, but sadness that it had come to this with my sister. I'd expected her to understand why I was upset, maybe even apologize for the misunderstanding. Instead, she'd acted like I was being unreasonable for wanting to control access to something I paid for. The next evening, there was a sharp knock on my apartment door. I opened it to find Melissa standing there, and she did not look happy. My phone won't connect to your Wi-Fi anymore, she said without preamble. I changed the password, I replied calmly. Why would you do that? I told you I was sorry. I shook my head. You didn't tell me you were sorry. You told me I was making a big deal out of nothing and suggested I should pay for faster internet. Oh my God, Trevor. Can you just give me the new password? This is ridiculous. Yes, sir? I'll give you the password when you can promise me that you won't share it with anyone else, I said. That includes Brandon. Melissa's eyes widened in disbelief. You want me to promise not to give the password to my boyfriend? That's insane. What am I supposed to tell him? You can tell him that it's my internet connection and I get to decide who uses it, I said. The same way he gets to decide who uses his truck or his Netflix account. That's completely different, she protested. No, it's not. It's exactly the same. These are personal resources that we pay for and get to control. Melissa threw up her hands in frustration. I can't control what other people do, Trevor. If I give Brandon the password and he shares it, that's not my fault. Yes, it is your fault, I said firmly. When someone gives you access to something, you're responsible for not abusing that access. And part of not abusing it means not sharing it without permission. This is stupid, she said. It's just Wi-Fi. Family should share things. Family should also respect each other's boundaries, I replied. I was happy to share with you and Brandon. I wasn't happy to share with a bunch of strangers who were using so much bandwidth that it affected my work. So that's it? You're just going to cut me off. I'm not cutting you off. I'm asking for a very simple promise that you won't share the password. If you can't make that promise, then yes, I'm going to protect my internet connection. Melissa stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her processing this. Part of me hoped she'd realize how reasonable my request was and just agree to it. But instead, she shook her head. I'm not making promises about what I do in my relationship, she said. Brandon and I share everything, and I'm not going to start keeping secrets from him because you're paranoid about your precious internet. Then I guess we're done here, I said. She turned and stormed off, and I closed the door feeling both vindicated and terrible. Was I being unreasonable? Was this really worth damaging my relationship with my sister? But every time I questioned myself, I came back to the same conclusion. I'd made a simple, reasonable request, and she'd refused to honor it. The next few days were awkward. Melissa avoided me, and when we did cross paths, she'd give me cold looks or make passive-aggressive comments about how some people were selfish with their resources. I tried to go about my normal routine, but the tension was obvious to everyone. Then came the Sunday dinner that changed everything. Our family had maintained the tradition of Sunday dinners for years. It was our time to catch up, share what was happening in our lives, and just enjoy each other's company. These dinners had always been one of my favorite parts of the week, but as I walked into the house that Sunday, I could feel the tension in the air. Mom had made her famous pot roast, and the dining room smelled amazing. Dad was in his usual spot at the head of the table, and Melissa was already seated with Brandon beside her. They both looked up when I entered, but neither of them smiled. Hey everyone, I said, trying to keep things normal. Hi sweetheart, Mom replied, bringing in the vegetables. How was your week? Good, I said, taking my usual seat across from Melissa. Busy with work, but good. The first part of dinner proceeded normally enough. We talked about Dad's golf game, Mom's book club, and Brandon shared some stories from his construction job. But I could sense that Melissa was building up to something. She kept shooting meaningful looks at our parents and had that expression she'd always gotten as a kid when she was planning to tattle on me. Finally, about halfway through the meal, she made her move. Mom, Dad, she said, setting down her fork and adopting a wounded tone. I need to talk to you about something Trevor did. I felt my stomach drop, but I tried to stay calm. Melissa, we don't need to involve Mom and Dad in this. Actually, we do, she said, turning to face our parents. Trevor is being completely selfish and unreasonable, and I think you should know about it. Mom looked concerned, and Dad put down his fork, giving us both his full attention. What's going on? Mom asked. Melissa launched into her version of the story, carefully framing everything to make herself look like the victim. According to her telling, she'd politely asked to borrow my Wi-Fi password for occasional use when the house internet was slow. I'd given it to her, but then I'd freaked out when Brandon's friends used it one time and had completely overreacted by changing the password and cutting her off. He's being so petty, she concluded. It's just internet access, and we're family. I don't understand why he's being so stingy about sharing something that doesn't even cost him extra money. I listened to this revisionist history with growing frustration. She'd conveniently left out the fact that 7 additional devices were connected to my network, that my work had been affected, and that I'd offered to give her the new password if she'd simply promised not to share it again. Trevor, Dad said in that disappointed tone I remembered from childhood. Is this true? You won't share your internet with your sister? That's not what happened, I said, trying to keep my voice level. I was happy to share with Melissa and Brandon. The problem is that Brandon shared the password with his friends without asking me, and it was affecting my ability to work from home. I changed the password and offered to give Melissa the new one if she'd promise not to share it again. She refused. Why should she have to promise that? Mom asked. Your family. Family shares things. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. So if I gave Dad my car keys and he lent my car to a stranger who got in an accident, that would be okay because we're family? That's different, Dad said. We're talking about internet access. No, we're talking about respect and boundaries, I replied. I pay for that internet connection. I rely on it for my job. When someone shares my password with people I don't know, and those people use so much bandwidth that it affects my work, that's a problem. Brandon, who had been silent up until now, finally spoke up. Dude, I'm sorry about that. I didn't realize it would slow things down for you. My buddies just needed to download some files for work, and their connection is garbage. I thought it would be fine. I appreciated that he at least acknowledged the issue, but his apology felt hollow. Brandon, if you'd asked me first, we could have figured out a solution. Maybe we could have scheduled it for a time when I wasn't working, or found another way to help your friends. But just sharing my password without asking wasn't okay. See, that's exactly what I mean, Melissa interjected. You're making everything into this big complicated thing when it should be simple. We're family, Trevor. Family helps each other without making lists of rules and conditions. Family also respects each other, I shot back. And part of respect means not taking advantage of someone's generosity. You're acting like I committed some major crime, Melissa said, her voice rising. I shared a Wi-Fi password. Big deal. You're being completely dramatic about this. I'm being dramatic? I asked incredulously. Melissa, I asked for one simple thing. A promise that you wouldn't share the password again. You refused to make that promise and then got our parents involved to try to pressure me into giving you what you want. Who's being dramatic here? That's enough, Dad said firmly. Trevor, I don't care who's right or wrong about the technical details. The bottom line is that you're refusing to help your sister over something trivial. That's not how we raised you. I felt like I'd been slapped. Something trivial? Dad, this affected my ability to do my job. How is that trivial? Because it's family, Mom said, as if that explained everything. When family needs something, you help them. You don't make conditions and rules and complications. So if Melissa needed to borrow my car every day, I'd be selfish for asking her not to lend it to strangers, I asked. Trevor, stop being ridiculous, Melissa said. Nobody's asking to borrow your car every day. We're talking about letting me use your internet sometimes. No, we're talking about letting you use my internet and then letting Brandon give access to whoever he wants without asking me, I corrected. The conversation continued to spiral, with my parents consistently taking Melissa's side and dismissing my concerns as petty or selfish. Brandon tried to stay neutral, occasionally offering mild apologies, but he clearly wasn't willing to commit to not sharing the password in the future. Melissa remained defiant, insisting that she shouldn't have to make promises about what she did in her relationship and that I was being controlling and unreasonable. Finally, I'd had enough. You know what? Fine. You all think I'm being selfish and petty? Then I guess I'm selfish and petty. But it's my internet connection, I pay for it, and I get to decide who uses it. If that makes me the bad guy, then so be it. I stood up from the table, my dinner barely touched. Thanks for the meal, Mom. I'm going home. As I walked toward the door, I heard Dad call after me. Trevor, don't leave like this. Sit back down and let's work this out. I paused at the doorway and turned back to face my family. There's nothing to work out, Dad. I made a reasonable request, and everyone here thinks it's unreasonable. So we disagree. I'll respect your opinion that I'm being selfish, and I hope you'll respect my right to control my own internet connection. Trevor, Melissa called out, and for a moment her voice sounded less angry and more hurt. Come on, don't let this stupid fight ruin our family dinner. I'm not the one who brought it up at family dinner, I replied. But you're right about one thing. This is stupid. It's stupid that a simple request for respect turned into this big drama. It's stupid that nobody seems to understand why I might want to control access to something I pay for. And it's stupid that I'm being made to feel guilty for setting a boundary. I left the house feeling angry, hurt, and completely isolated. My own family thought I was being unreasonable for wanting to control my internet connection. My sister had refused to make a simple promise and had instead chosen to escalate the conflict by involving our parents. And my parents had automatically taken her side without really listening to my perspective. That night I lay in bed replaying the conversation over and over, wondering if I really was being unreasonable. Should family trump everything else? Should I just give Melissa the password and accept that I had no control over who else used my internet? Was maintaining family harmony worth more than standing up for my boundaries? But every time I considered backing down, I came back to the same core issues. This wasn't really about Wi-Fi passwords. This was about respect, boundaries, and the fact that my own sister thought she could take advantage of my generosity without any consequences. If I gave in now, what message would that send? That my boundaries didn't matter? That family could take whatever they wanted from me as long as they framed it as a family obligation? The next few weeks were tense and uncomfortable. Melissa barely spoke to me, and when she did, it was with a coldness that hurt more than I expected. My parents continued to make comments about how I should just share and stop being stubborn. Sunday dinners became exercises in awkward silence and passive-aggressive comments. But then something interesting started happening. I began noticing things I'd missed before. Patterns of behavior that suddenly made more sense in the context of our Wi-Fi argument. Melissa had always been quick to ask for favors but slow to reciprocate. She'd borrow money and forget to pay it back until reminded multiple times. She'd use other people's things without asking, and then act surprised when they were upset about it. I started to wonder if the Wi-Fi situation was just the latest example of a much larger pattern. Had Melissa always taken advantage of people's generosity, secure in the knowledge that family and friends would enable her behavior rather than confront her about it? Had I been so focused on maintaining our relationship that I'd been blind to the fact that it was pretty one-sided? The more I thought about it, the more examples I could remember. In college, she'd constantly borrowed money from our parents, promising to pay it back but never actually doing so. She'd use my car when hers was in the shop and return it with an empty gas tank. She'd invite friends over to family gatherings without asking, and then act like anyone who minded was being unwelcoming. I'd always made excuses for these behaviors. Melissa was younger. She was still figuring things out. She didn't mean any harm. But maybe the truth was simpler. Maybe she'd learned that she could take whatever she wanted from the people who cared about her, and they'd ultimately forgive her because cutting her off would be more painful than enabling her. The realization was both liberating and heartbreaking. Liberating because it meant I wasn't crazy or selfish for setting boundaries. Heartbreaking because it meant my relationship with my sister wasn't as healthy or equal as I'd believed. 3 weeks after the disastrous Sunday dinner, something happened that changed everything. I was coming home from work on a Thursday evening when I noticed Brandon's truck wasn't in the driveway, which was unusual since he was there almost every night. The house seemed quieter than normal, and I didn't see any lights on in Melissa's room. I went up to my apartment and was settling in for the evening when I heard raised voices coming from the main house. At first, I tried to ignore it. Families argue sometimes, and it wasn't any of my business. But the voices were getting louder, and I could hear what sounded like Melissa crying. Against my better judgment, I went to my window and looked down at the backyard. Through the kitchen window, I could see my parents and Melissa in what appeared to be a heated conversation. Dad was gesturing emphatically, Mom had her arms crossed, and Melissa was clearly upset. I debated whether to go down and see if everything was okay. But before I could decide, Melissa burst out the back door and started walking toward the garage. She looked up and saw me in the window. "Trevor!" she called out, her voice shaky. "Can I come up? I need to talk to you." This was the first time she'd spoken to me normally in weeks, and she looked genuinely distressed. Despite everything that had happened between us, she was still my little sister, and I couldn't ignore that she was upset. "Of course," I called back. "Come on up." A minute later, she was knocking on my door. When I opened it, I could see she'd been crying. Her eyes were red and puffy, and she looked more vulnerable than I'd seen her in years. "Can I sit down?" she asked quietly. Sure, I said, gesturing to my small couch. What's going on? Are you okay? Melissa sat down and took a shaky breath. Brandon broke up with me, she said, and then the tears started flowing again. I sat down next to her, and despite all our recent conflict, my first instinct was to comfort her. Oh, Mel, I'm sorry. What happened? He said he needs space, she said between sobs. He said he's been feeling suffocated and that he needs to figure out what he wants. But I think there's someone else. I handed her a tissue from the box on my coffee table. What makes you think that? He's been acting weird for the past couple of weeks. Secretive. He stops texting people when I walk into the room, and yesterday I saw him at the coffee shop downtown with some girl I've never seen before. I felt a surge of protective anger toward Brandon, despite all the complications he'd brought into our lives. Did you ask him about her? I tried, but he just said it was nobody important and that I was being paranoid. But Trevor, I know something's going on. I can feel it. We sat in silence for a few minutes while Melissa cried. I found myself forgetting about our Wi-Fi argument and just focusing on the fact that my sister was hurting. Whatever issues we had between us, I hated seeing her in pain. I'm really sorry, Mel, I said finally. I know you cared about him a lot. She nodded, wiping her eyes with the tissue. I thought we were going to get married. I thought he was the one. God, I feel so stupid. You're not stupid, I said firmly. You fell in love with someone who turned out not to deserve it. That's not your fault. Melissa looked at me with surprise, as if she'd expected me to say, I told you so, or remind her of all the problems Brandon had caused. But despite everything, I genuinely felt bad for her. Heartbreak was heartbreak, regardless of the circumstances. Trevor, she said quietly, I owe you an apology. I looked at her in surprise. What do you mean? About the Wi-Fi thing. About everything that happened. I've been thinking about it a lot since we fought, and I realize you were right. This was not what I'd expected to hear. Melissa, you don't have to apologize just because you're upset about Brandon. No, I do need to apologize, she said, shaking her head. Not because of Brandon, but because I finally understand what you were trying to tell me. You did me a favor by sharing your password, and I let Brandon take advantage of that. When you asked me to promise not to share it again, that was completely reasonable, and I should have agreed immediately. I stared at her, hardly believing what I was hearing. What changed your mind? Melissa let out a bitter laugh. Ironically, it was Brandon. After we got in that fight at Sunday dinner, he kept making comments about how your family was loaded and how you could afford to share your internet. He started talking about other ways we could take advantage of the family resources. He suggested we should ask to borrow Dad's tools for his construction projects, or see if we could store some of his stuff in Mom and Dad's garage. I felt my jaw tighten. He said that? Yeah, and when I told him that didn't feel right to me, he said I was being stupid. He said family was supposed to help each other, and if your family had money and resources, we should be smart about using them. The picture was becoming clearer, and I didn't like what I was seeing. So this whole time, he wasn't just casually sharing my Wi-Fi password. He was actively looking for ways to take advantage of our family's generosity. I think so, Melissa said miserably, and I think I was so caught up in defending him and our relationship that I couldn't see what was really happening. When you tried to set a boundary, I saw it as an attack on Brandon. So I got defensive instead of listening to what you were actually saying. I felt a complex mix of emotions, vindication that I'd been right about Brandon's motivations, sadness that Melissa had been manipulated, and anger at how the whole situation had played out. Melissa, I said carefully, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me. Looking back now, do you think Brandon was using you to get access to our family's resources? She was quiet for a long moment, and I could see her processing this possibility. I don't know, she said finally. Maybe. He always seemed so interested in family dinner, in spending time at the house. I thought it was because he wanted to be part of the family, but now I'm wondering if it was because he saw opportunities. What do you mean? Well, he was always asking questions about Dad's business, about how much money our family had, about what kinds of investments Dad made. At the time, I thought he was just trying to make conversation and show interest, but now it feels different. I felt sick thinking about how Brandon had probably been calculating ways to take advantage of our family's hospitality from the very beginning. Melissa, I'm really sorry. Nobody deserves to be used like that. The worst part, she continued, is that I dragged you into it. I made you the bad guy when you were just trying to protect yourself and your resources. I got Mom and Dad involved and made them think you were being selfish when you were actually being reasonable. This was the apology I'd been hoping for, but hearing it now, in the context of Melissa's heartbreak, felt bittersweet. I was glad she understood my perspective, but I hated that it had taken her getting hurt for her to see the truth about Brandon's character. "I forgive you," I said simply, "and I'm sorry you had to find out about Brandon this way." "There's more," she said, and something in her tone made me pay closer attention. "When Brandon was breaking up with me tonight, he said some things that made me realize how wrong I was about the Wi-Fi situation." "What did he say?" "He said that he'd been planning to ask your parents if he could move into the basement temporarily while he looked for a new place. He thought they'd say yes because they liked him, and because I'd want them to help him out." I felt my anger flare again. "He was going to try to move into Mom and Dad's house?" "Yeah, and when I told him that seemed presumptuous, he said, 'Come on, your family has plenty of space and money. They can afford to help me out for a few months.' That's when I realized that he'd never seen our family as people he cared about. He saw us as resources to be used. The full scope of Brandon's manipulation was becoming clear, and I felt a surge of protectiveness toward my parents. They'd been so welcoming to him, so eager to include him in family activities, and he'd been calculating how to take advantage of their generosity the entire time. "Did you tell Mom and Dad about this?" I asked. "That's what we were fighting about when you saw us through the window," Melissa said. "I told them about Brandon's comments and about how he'd been planning to ask to move in. I also told them that I realized you were right about the Wi-Fi situation and that I owed you an apology." "Oh, how did they react?" Melissa wiped her eyes again. "Dad got really quiet, which you know is never a good sign. Then he started asking me questions about other things Brandon had said or done. Mom looked like she wanted to drive over to Brandon's place and give him a piece of her mind. I could picture Dad's reaction perfectly. He was usually jovial and laid back, but when he felt like someone had taken advantage of his family, he could become ice cold in his anger. They feel terrible about how they handled the Sunday dinner situation," Melissa continued. "Dad said he was sorry for not listening to your side of the story properly. Mom said she was so focused on wanting us to get along that she missed the bigger picture." I felt a wave of relief wash over me. For weeks, I'd been questioning whether I was really being unreasonable, whether my parents were right that I should just share everything without conditions because we were family. Hearing that they now understood my perspective meant more to me than I'd realized. "I'm glad they see it differently now," I said, "but I'm sorry it took all this drama to get there." "Trevor, there's something else I need to tell you," Melissa said, and her tone became more serious. "Something that might explain why I was so defensive about Brandon, and why I couldn't see what was really happening." "What do you mean?" She took a deep breath before continuing. "For the past few months, Brandon had been telling me that your family didn't really respect me. He said that Mom and Dad treated me like a child who couldn't take care of herself, and that you thought you were better than me because you had your own place and a better job." I felt my heart sink. "Melissa, you know that's not true, right?" "I know that now," she said quickly. "But at the time, it felt like it might be true. You know how I've always been insecure about being the younger one, about feeling like I haven't figured out my life the way you have. When Brandon said those things, it played into fears I already had. This revelation helped explain so much about Melissa's behavior during our conflict. If Brandon had been poisoning her against our family, making her feel like we looked down on her, then of course she would have been defensive when I tried to set boundaries. She probably saw my Wi-Fi request as confirmation of Brandon's claims that I thought I was better than her. So when I asked you not to share the password, I said, you heard it as me trying to control you or exclude you." "Exactly," she said. "Brandon had me convinced that you were looking for ways to make me feel small. So when you changed the password, it felt like you were punishing me for not being successful enough to afford my own fancy internet." I shook my head, feeling angry at Brandon all over again. "Melissa, I have never thought I was better than you. Never. I was proud of you for taking your time to figure out what you wanted to do with your career. I was happy that you found someone who seemed to make you happy. The Wi-Fi thing was never about you personally. It was about protecting something I needed for work." "I see that now," she said. "But Brandon was really good at making me doubt myself and doubt my relationships with other people. He'd point out little things and make them seem bigger than they were. Like when you'd come to family dinner and talk about your work projects. He'd say afterward that you were showing off or trying to make me feel bad about not having a career yet. The manipulation was even worse than I'd realized. Brandon hadn't just been using our family's resources. He'd been systematically undermining Melissa's relationships with us, probably to make her more dependent on him." "How long had he been saying things like that?" I asked. "Pretty much since the beginning," she admitted. "But it got worse over the past couple of months. He started suggesting that maybe we should get our own place together, somewhere we could have more privacy and independence from my family. He made it sound romantic, like it was about our relationship, but now I think he was trying to isolate me." I felt sick thinking about how close Brandon had come to succeeding in his manipulation. If Melissa had moved out with him, if she'd become more distant from our family, she might never have seen through his act. "Melissa, I'm really sorry you went through that," I said. "Nobody should have to deal with someone trying to turn them against their own family." "The thing that bothers me most," she said, "is that I let him do it. I started questioning relationships that had been solid my whole life because some guy I'd been dating for 8 months told me I should. How could I be so stupid?" "You weren't stupid," I said firmly. "You were manipulated by someone who was very good at it. That's not the same thing." We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes. Despite everything that had happened, it felt good to have my sister back. The past few weeks had been lonely and stressful, and I'd missed having her in my life. "So what happens now?" I asked finally. "Well, first I owe Mom and Dad a proper apology for dragging them into our fight and for not seeing what Brandon was really doing," she said. "And I owe you more than just an apology. I owe you a promise that I'll never let someone manipulate me into disrespecting your boundaries again." "Melissa, you don't have to promise anything dramatic," I started, but she held up her hand. "Yes, I do. Trevor, I almost lost my relationship with my brother because I let some guy convince me that setting reasonable boundaries was the same as being controlling. That can't ever happen again." I appreciated her sentiment, but I could see she was still processing everything that had happened. "Let's just take things one step at a time," I said. "The important thing is that we understand each other now." "Can I ask you something?" she said. "If I promised not to share it with anyone, and I mean actually promised, not just said I would you give me your Wi-Fi password again?" I smiled, feeling like we'd finally come full circle. "Of course I would. But honestly, you can just use the house Wi-Fi. I talked to Dad last week about upgrading the router downstairs, and the new one should be much faster." "You did that?" "Yeah." I felt bad about the whole situation. Even though I thought I was right about the boundary issue, I didn't like that there was a technology problem I could have helped solve earlier. Melissa's eyes filled with tears again. But this time they looked like tears of gratitude rather than sadness. "You're a really good brother, you know that?" "You're a pretty good sister too," I replied. "Even when we're fighting about stupid internet passwords." She laughed, and for the first time in weeks it felt like everything might actually be okay between us. The next few days brought a series of conversations that helped repair the damage that had been done to our family relationships. Melissa had a long talk with our parents, apologizing for her role in the Sunday dinner confrontation and explaining what she'd learned about Brandon's manipulation tactics. Mom and Dad, in turn, called me to apologize for not listening more carefully to my concerns and for assuming I was being petty without understanding the full situation. Dad was particularly upset when he realized how Brandon had been calculating ways to take advantage of our family's generosity. "I invited that boy into our home," he said during our phone conversation. "I treated him like a son, and he was looking at us like we were marks in some kind of con game." "Dad, you couldn't have known," I said. "He was good at hiding his real intentions." "But you saw through him," Dad replied. "When you set that boundary about the Wi-Fi, you were protecting yourself from exactly the kind of person he turned out to be. I should have trusted your judgment instead of assuming you were being difficult." It felt good to have my father's support, but I also understood why he'd reacted the way he did initially. Our family had always been close and generous with each other, and the idea that someone would try to exploit that generosity was foreign to him. Mom's reaction was different but equally validating. When she called to apologize, she was angry, not at me but at Brandon and at herself for not seeing what was happening. "I keep thinking about all the times he asked questions about our finances or made comments about how lucky our family was," she said. "At the time, I thought he was just curious about our lives, but now those conversations feel very different." "Mom, he was good at making it seem innocent," I said. "Even I didn't realize the full extent of what he was doing until Melissa told me about his other comments." "I'm just glad Melissa figured it out before she got in any deeper with him," Mom said. "And I'm sorry we made you feel like you were wrong for wanting to protect your resources. You were being responsible, not selfish." The conversation with Mom helped me realize something important about family dynamics. The people who love us most are often the most vulnerable to manipulation that targets our relationships with each other. Brandon had been smart enough to understand that our family's closeness was both our strength and our potential weakness. By framing my boundary setting as selfishness and encouraging my parents to pressure me, he'd almost succeeded in using our love for each other against us. About a week after Melissa's revelation, I ran into Brandon at the grocery store. I was in the produce section when I spotted him by the bananas, and my first instinct was to avoid him entirely. But then I realized I didn't need to hide or feel uncomfortable. I hadn't done anything wrong. He saw me at the same time and walked over with what looked like a nervous smile. "Hey Trevor, how's it going?" "Fine," I replied neutrally, continuing to select apples. "Look, man, I know things got kind of weird with the whole internet thing," he said. "I want you to know there are no hard feelings on my end." I looked at him with amazement. Even now, after everything that had happened, he was trying to minimize his behavior and make it seem like our weird situation was just some misunderstanding between equals. "Brandon," I said calmly, "you shared my Wi-Fi password with multiple people without asking, which affected my ability to work. When I asked for a simple promise that it wouldn't happen again, you refused and encouraged my sister and parents to pressure me into giving you unconditional access to something I pay for. There's nothing weird about that. It's just disrespectful." He looked uncomfortable, probably not expecting me to be so direct. "I guess I just didn't think it was that big a deal," he said. "My friends really needed the internet access, and I was trying to help them out. At my expense," I pointed out. "Without my permission, using resources I pay for." "Yeah, okay, maybe I should have asked," he conceded. "But it's not like it cost you extra money or anything." I realized this conversation was pointless. Brandon still didn't understand, or didn't want to understand, why his behavior had been problematic. He was still framing it as a minor oversight rather than a violation of trust and boundaries. "Brandon, I hope things work out well for you," I said, putting an end to the conversation. "But in the future, when someone does you a favor, don't take advantage of their generosity." I walked away before he could respond, feeling proud of myself for staying calm and stating my position clearly. For months, I'd been second-guessing whether my reaction to the Wi-Fi situation was reasonable. That brief conversation confirmed that I'd been right to trust my instincts about Brandon's character. As the weeks passed, our family dynamic settled into a new normal that felt healthier than before. Melissa and I were closer than we'd been in years, partly because we'd worked through a real conflict and come out stronger on the other side. She started dating again eventually, but she was much more careful about introducing new boyfriends to the family, and much more aware of red flags around manipulation and boundary crossing. Our parents upgraded the house Wi-Fi system, which solved the original technical problem that had started the whole mess. But more importantly, we all learned something valuable about the difference between family generosity and family exploitation. Being related to someone doesn't give them the right to take advantage of your resources or manipulate your relationships with other family members. The Sunday dinners resumed their normal, comfortable atmosphere. Though we were all more aware now of how someone with bad intentions could exploit family dynamics, we developed better communication patterns, talking more directly about boundaries and expectations instead of assuming everyone was on the same page. Looking back now, I'm actually grateful for the whole Wi-Fi password drama, as strange as that sounds. It forced us to have conversations about respect, boundaries, and family loyalty that we probably never would have had otherwise. It also taught me to trust my instincts when someone's behavior doesn't feel right, even if other people are telling me I'm overreacting. Melissa learned even more valuable lessons about recognizing manipulation in relationships and not allowing anyone to turn her against her family. She's become much more confident in setting her own boundaries and much better at identifying when someone is trying to isolate her or undermine her other relationships. The whole experience reminded me that family love doesn't mean family members get to take whatever they want from each other without consequences. Real love includes respect for boundaries, consideration for each other's needs, and the willingness to have difficult conversations when someone crosses a line. Most importantly, I learned that standing up for yourself doesn't make you selfish, even when people you love are telling you it does. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for your family is to model healthy boundaries and refuse to enable destructive behavior, even when it's uncomfortable in the moment. Today, Melissa and I are closer than ever. She has her own apartment now and her own internet connection, which she guards carefully and only shares with people she trusts completely. We laugh sometimes about the great Wi-Fi war of 2024, but we both know it was about much more than internet access. It was about learning to respect each other as adults, to communicate clearly about our needs and boundaries, and to protect our family from people who would try to exploit our love for each other. And yes, for anyone wondering, I did eventually give Melissa my Wi-Fi password again. She never shared it with anyone, and she never needed to, because she learned to value the trust that password represented. Sometimes the most important battles aren't about winning or losing. They're about teaching the people we love how we deserve to be treated. The whole situation taught me that family isn't about unlimited access to each other's resources. It's about mutual respect, clear communication, and the wisdom to know when someone is trying to damage the relationships that matter most to us. Brandon may have thought he was clever, manipulating our family dynamics to get what he wanted. But in the end, he just strengthened our bonds and taught us all valuable lessons about protecting what we've built together. So am I the asshole for refusing to give my sister my Wi-Fi password? Looking back now, I know the answer is no. I was protecting my resources, my work, and ultimately my family from someone who saw our love for each other as a weakness to be exploited. Sometimes being the asshole in the moment is exactly what your family needs you to be.